The room was frozen in a stunned silence. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Every eye in the lavishly decorated boardroom was locked on her, a woman in a simple, spotless uniform that starkly contrasted the designer suits surrounding her. Just moments ago, this same room had been buzzing with condescending laughter at her expense. They had mocked her, dismissed her as invisible, a mere shadow flitting between their polished egos. But now, she stood commanding the room, her voice unwavering. "I will not be spoken to like that again. And you," she pointed directly at the stunned CEO at the head of the table, "are fired. Effective immediately." Gasps erupted around the room like a chain reaction. The CEO, a man notorious for his unshakable authority, looked as if someone had slapped him in the face. "Excuse me," he stammered, his voice faltering. "You heard me," she said, locking eyes with him. "You're done. Security will escort you out within the hour." The disbelief was almost audible. Whispers began to ripple among the executives. This was the CEO, a man untouchable in every sense of the word. And here was a cleaning lady, standing tall and resolute, doing what no one else had dared. "How dare you?" he spat, his face red with fury. "You have no authority." Her lips curled into a wry smile. "Oh, but I do. And when I explain why, everyone here will understand exactly how I'm able to do this. But first," she paused, her gaze sweeping over the room, "let me tell you a little story." The air felt charged, every person at the table holding their breath. No one dared move, no one dared interrupt. She stepped closer to the head of the table, gripping its edge as if to ground herself before she unraveled the tale that would turn their world upside down. "And trust me," she said, her voice low but electric, "when I'm finished, you'll never look at me the same way again." Months earlier, the story had begun in the same towering corporate building. She had entered the office every day at dawn, her mop and bucket clattering against the pristine tile floors. Her name was Janice Owens, and while her title was custodian, she was so much more than the world saw. Yet to the employees in this building, she was invisible, a part of the scenery, like the coffee machine or the ficus plant in the corner. They greeted her with curt nods or, more often, not at all. And then came that one day, the day the whispers started. Months before Janice Owens had shocked the boardroom, her life seemed like a monotonous routine. Every morning, she arrived before the sun, armed with cleaning supplies and a quiet determination. She was meticulous. Every desk, every corner of the expansive office space gleamed when she was finished. To Janice, her work wasn't just a job, it was a reflection of her pride and discipline. But to the office workers, she was background noise, an afterthought. They didn't know the woman behind the mop. It all started one particularly chaotic morning. The office was abuzz with activity. Suits scurried around, phones rang incessantly, and tension thickened the air. Janice quietly maneuvered through the sea of power players, her cart laden with supplies. No one acknowledged her as usual, until she overheard a snippet of conversation. "The quarterly numbers are in," one junior executive whispered anxiously to another. "If the CEO finds out how bad they are, heads will roll." Janice paused, pretending to adjust her cart. She wasn't one to eavesdrop, but the tone of urgency caught her attention. A sinking company. Poor numbers. She'd seen enough corporate chaos during her time here to know this wasn't normal. Later that afternoon, as she cleaned the executive break room, Janice noticed a pile of papers left on the counter. A spreadsheet with glaring red numbers at the bottom confirmed her suspicions. The company was in trouble. Serious trouble. She folded the paper neatly and placed it back where she found it. "Not my business," she muttered under her breath. But even as she returned to her work, something nagged at her. For years, she'd been absorbing bits and pieces of conversations, reading forgotten memos, even recognizing subtle patterns in behavior. She understood more about this company's operations than anyone would have guessed. And she could see it clear as day. The ship was sinking, and no one seemed prepared to stop it. That evening, Janice went home to her modest apartment, her thoughts racing. She sat down at her small dining table, a pile of notebooks spread before her. Over the years, she had kept meticulous notes on everything she had observed: financial trends, employee behavior, even the CEO's erratic decisions. To most, she was just a cleaning lady. But Janice Owens had a mind for strategy. Her late husband, David, had always encouraged her sharp intellect. "You could run a company yourself," he used to say, beaming with pride. And while she never pursued formal business training, she had an uncanny knack for recognizing opportunities and threats. As she flipped through her notes, she realized the company's current predicament wasn't an accident. It was the result of years of negligence and mismanagement at the top. The CEO, Richard Coleman, had been using company funds for personal luxuries, extravagant trips, private jets, even a mansion in the Hamptons. And he had been covering it up by shifting money between accounts, creating a financial house of cards. She had pieced it all together over time, though no one would have believed her if she had spoken up. "Not yet," she whispered to herself, a plan forming in her mind. The next day, the office was buzzing with gossip about an impending audit. Employees were nervous, especially the younger ones who feared layoffs. Janice worked quietly, but she could feel the tension like static in the air. As she cleaned the corner offices, she heard snippets of conversations again. Executives scrambling to cover tracks, blaming one another for the company's precarious position. That afternoon, as she wiped down the glass walls of the conference room, she overheard Richard Coleman himself on a call. His voice was calm, almost smug. "Don't worry about the audit," he said to whoever was on the other end. "I'll handle it. They won't find a thing." Janice clenched her jaw. She had seen the spreadsheets, the discrepancies in the budgets. Coleman wasn't just mishandling funds, he was sinking the livelihoods of hundreds of employees to maintain his own lavish lifestyle. For the first time, Janice felt a spark of anger. This wasn't just about numbers. It was about the people she saw every day, the young woman who always stayed late at her desk, the single dad who talked about his kids while grabbing coffee. They all deserved better. That night, Janice made a decision. She would not stay silent. But she couldn't confront Coleman directly, not yet. She needed to be strategic, to gather undeniable proof. Over the next few weeks, she began documenting everything. She kept copies of discarded financial statements, snapped photos of confidential documents left unattended, and even recorded snippets of incriminating conversations. But the most damning evidence came unexpectedly. One evening, as she emptied the trash in Coleman's office, she noticed a USB drive left on his desk. It was small and unassuming, but something about it caught her attention. Glancing around to ensure she was alone, she pocketed it. At home, she plugged it into her laptop, and her heart raced as she saw folder after folder of files labeled private, offshore accounts, and audit notes. Janice sat back, staring at the screen. This wasn't just negligence. This was fraud. Janice had the evidence, but she knew exposing it wouldn't be simple. She needed a platform, someone who would listen. Someone who wouldn't dismiss her as just a cleaning lady. And that's when she got the idea. A smile played on her lips as she thought of the one group Richard Coleman couldn't ignore. Janice's plan was bold, but she knew she had to play her cards carefully. Armed with a USB drive and her growing collection of evidence, she spent several nights refining her approach. She wasn't just going to expose Richard Coleman, she was going to make sure everyone in the company, and beyond, knew the truth. The first step was finding allies, but that wasn't as easy as it sounded. Janice was well aware of how she was perceived in the office. No one would take her seriously if she simply barged into an executive's office with accusations. She needed someone who was already skeptical of Coleman's leadership, someone smart enough to connect the dots but not entrenched enough in the system to be complicit. Her opportunity came during an early morning shift. While cleaning the break room, Janice overheard two junior employees venting over coffee. "Coleman's playing with fire," one of them said, shaking his head. "If this audit goes sideways, we're all screwed." The other scoffed. "Yeah, but what are we supposed to do? He's untouchable. Even the board won't go against him." Janice listened intently as they continued. She noted their names, Jason and Emily, and waited until they left. Later that day, as she cleaned near their desks, she struck up a conversation with Jason. "You're working late again," she said casually, pushing her mop. "Big project." Jason looked up, startled. "Oh yeah. Just trying to stay ahead of things." He glanced back at his screen, clearly uncomfortable. Janice hesitated before speaking again. "You know, I've been here a long time. Seen a lot of things. Sometimes, I wonder if people notice what's really going on." Jason frowned, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Janice gave a small smile. "Just, Sometimes people in power think no one's paying attention. But some of us see more than they realize. She moved on before he could respond, leaving him with a seed of curiosity. The next morning, Jason approached her as she cleaned near the elevator. "Hey, Janice," he said hesitantly. "About what you said yesterday. What did you mean?" Janice paused, looking around to ensure they weren't overheard. "You seem smart, Jason. I think you already know the answer to that." She leaned in slightly. "But if you're serious about protecting your job, and everyone else's, you might want to take a closer look at the numbers." "Really look?" Jason's expression shifted from confusion to determination. "Okay. I'll think about it." Over the next week, Janice kept her distance but noticed Jason and Emily poring over reports and whispering more frequently. Her subtle nudges had worked. They were beginning to piece things together on their own. But Janice knew she couldn't stop there. She needed them fully on her side before making her next move. One evening, as Jason and Emily worked late, Janice approached their desks with a purposeful stride. She carried a manila folder in one hand, her uniform as unassuming as ever. "Sorry to interrupt," she said softly, placing the folder on Jason's desk. "But I think you'll want to see this." Jason and Emily exchanged puzzled glances before opening the folder. Inside were copies of financial documents, email printouts, and a detailed timeline Janice had compiled. Emily's eyes widened as she flipped through the pages. "Where did you get this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Janice smiled faintly. "Let's just say I've been paying attention for a long time. Coleman's been playing games, and if this goes on, the whole company will collapse." Jason leaned back in his chair, visibly shaken. This is enough to blow the audit wide open." "It's more than enough," Janice replied, her voice firm. "But you can't take it to him directly. He'll deny everything and bury the evidence before anyone else can see it." Emily frowned. "Then what do we do?" Janice's eyes glinted with resolve. "You're going to help me get it to the board." Getting the evidence to the board was no small task. Coleman had spent years building a fortress of loyalty around himself. Many of the executives were either complicit in his schemes or too intimidated to oppose him. Janice needed to ensure the information landed in the hands of those who couldn't ignore it. With Jason and Emily's help, she identified two board members with a reputation for integrity, Margaret Lewis and Thomas Carter. Both were known for their no-nonsense approach to business and their disdain for corporate corruption. Janice crafted a plan to anonymously deliver the evidence to Margaret and Thomas, but even anonymity required careful execution. If Coleman caught wind of the leak before the audit, he'd find a way to cover his tracks. Timing was everything. On a Friday evening, when most of the office had cleared out, Janice, Jason, and Emily executed their plan. They prepared two identical packages containing the evidence, each addressed to the respective board members. Jason used his access to the mailroom to slip the packages into the outgoing mail bin, ensuring they would be delivered first thing Monday morning. As Janice watched the bin close, a wave of anticipation and fear washed over her. This was the riskiest thing she had ever done. If Coleman discovered her involvement, it wouldn't just cost her job, it could destroy her entire life. But she reminded herself why she was doing this. The people in that building, the ones who had laughed at her, dismissed her, mocked her, they were human beings with families and dreams. They deserved to work in a place free from the shadow of corruption. By Monday morning, the packages had reached their destinations. Janice went about her routine, her heart pounding as she waited for the fallout. And then it began. Margaret Lewis called an emergency meeting with the audit committee. Thomas Carter followed suit. Whispers of misconduct and financial irregularities spread like wildfire. By lunchtime, Coleman's name was on everyone's lips. But Janice knew this was just the beginning. The storm was coming. The storm hit faster than anyone had anticipated. By Tuesday morning, the entire company was buzzing with rumors of misconduct at the highest level. Employees whispered in hallways, the tension crackling like static electricity. The word audit hung in the air like a specter, growing heavier by the hour. Janice kept her head down, moving through her cleaning routine as if nothing had changed. But inside, her heart raced. She had spent years blending into the background, and now every step felt like walking a tightrope. If anyone suspected her involvement, everything she'd worked for would be at risk. Meanwhile, in the executive suite, Richard Coleman was feeling the pressure. He stormed into his office, slamming the door so hard the walls trembled. His assistant, visibly shaken, avoided his gaze. Coleman had always prided himself on being untouchable, but the sudden scrutiny from the board was unlike anything he had ever faced. "What the hell is going on?" he barked into the phone, pacing back and forth. "Who's feeding them this nonsense?" His contact on the audit committee, a junior member eager to please, stammered on the other end. I don't know, sir. But Margaret Lewis is leading the charge. She has documents, evidence, they're saying. Offshore accounts, mismanaged funds." Coleman froze mid-stride. "Evidence?" His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "What evidence?" "I don't know how they got it, sir," the voice replied, clearly panicked. "But it's bad. They're calling for a formal investigation." Coleman's mind raced. The files on the USB drive, the spreadsheets, the emails. Someone had breached his carefully constructed fortress. But who? Down on the lower floors, Janice watched the chaos unfold with quiet satisfaction. She knew the board members wouldn't be able to ignore the evidence, and Coleman's arrogance would only dig him deeper into trouble. But her victory felt far from complete. The audit was just the first domino. To bring Coleman down for good, she needed to ensure the investigation reached a decisive conclusion, and she wasn't about to sit on the sidelines. That afternoon, an email from Margaret Lewis landed in the inboxes of every executive and department head. It called for an all-hands emergency meeting the following morning in the main boardroom. The subject line was simple but chilling: urgent, financial misconduct investigation. The meeting sent shockwaves through the building. People speculated about who would be implicated, who would be scapegoated, and whether layoffs were imminent. But no one dared to speak openly, especially not about Coleman. Janice, however, knew exactly what this meeting meant. It was time for the truth to come out. The next morning, Janice arrived at work earlier than usual. The boardroom had been prepped the night before, its long table polished to a mirror-like sheen. She moved through the space with practiced ease, placing fresh water bottles and neatly arranging chairs. But this time, she did more than just tidy up. From her cart, she retrieved a slim folder containing one final piece of evidence. It was a collection of documents she had kept hidden until now, detailing Coleman's use of company funds for personal expenses. Trips to Paris, luxury cars, and even a private yacht were all meticulously itemized, complete with receipts and email correspondence. She placed the folder at the head of the table, right where Margaret Lewis would sit. By 10 a.m., the boardroom was filled to capacity. Executives and department heads sat in tense silence, their eyes darting nervously around the room. At the center of the tension was Richard Coleman, seated at the head of the table. His usual confidence was replaced by a simmering anger barely concealed beneath a thin veneer of professionalism. Margaret Lewis entered last, carrying the folder Janice had left. She set it down in front of her, glancing briefly at Coleman before addressing the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her tone sharp and commanding, "we are here to discuss a matter of utmost importance. Over the past few weeks, serious allegations of financial misconduct have come to light. The evidence we've reviewed is extensive, and it paints a troubling picture of mismanagement at the highest levels." Coleman shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. "Margaret, if I may." "You may not," she interrupted, her gaze piercing. "The board has reviewed the documents, and we have questions that require immediate answers. Specifically, about these offshore accounts and unauthorized expenditures." She opened the folder and slid a stack of papers across the table toward Coleman. "Care to explain these?" Coleman picked up the papers, his face darkening as he scanned them. "This is absurd," he said, his voice rising. "These documents are fabricated, an attempt to undermine my leadership. I've dedicated my career to this company." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "And yet, the numbers don't lie. We have receipts, emails, and a clear trail leading back to you. If you have an alternative explanation, we're all ears." The room fell silent. Coleman's confidence faltered as the weight of the evidence became impossible to deny. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the door to the boardroom opened. Every head turned as Janice walked in. The shock was instantaneous. A low murmur spread through the room as people recognized her, the cleaning lady, the invisible figure they had ignored for years. But now, she stood tall, her posture exuding quiet strength. What is the meaning of this? Coleman snapped, his voice dripping with disdain. Who let her in here? Margaret held up a hand to silence him. She's here because she has more to say about this matter than anyone else in this room. Janice stepped forward, her eyes sweeping over the stunned faces. She placed her hands on the table, leaning in slightly. For years, I've watched this company from the sidelines. I've seen the corruption, the lies, and the greed. And I've kept quiet, until now. She locked eyes with Coleman, her voice steady. You built this empire on the backs of hard-working people. People who deserve better than the mess you've created. And today, they're going to get the truth. The room erupted in gasps and whispers, but Janice wasn't finished. This company is more than just a balance sheet. It's people's lives. And I'm here to make sure those lives aren't destroyed by your selfishness. Margaret leaned forward, her expression resolute. I think it's time we hear the full story, Janice. Start from the beginning. Janice took a deep breath, her mind racing. She was ready to expose everything, but she knew this was just the beginning of the fight. Janice stood at the head of the table, every pair of eyes glued to her. For the first time, she wasn't the invisible cleaning lady. She was the center of the storm, holding the room captive with her presence. Taking a deep breath, she began. For years, I've worked here, moving silently through these halls, cleaning up after all of you. I've seen and heard things you wouldn't believe, things you thought no one was paying attention to. Her voice was calm but resolute, each word slicing through the tense air. Mr. Coleman has been abusing his position for years, and I've been gathering proof. Coleman scoffed, his forced laugh echoing through the boardroom. This is absurd. Are we really going to sit here and listen to a janitor? She's fabricating all of this. Janice's lips curved into a faint smile. Then let's see if the documents I've provided match your truth. Shall we? She gestured toward the folder Margaret Lewis had in front of her. Margaret nodded and opened it again. These documents were anonymously delivered to me. They contain evidence of company funds being funneled into offshore accounts, extensive personal expenses disguised as business costs, and emails explicitly detailing how to manipulate the books before audits. Coleman's face turned a shade of red so intense it looked as though he might explode. This is a smear campaign. Someone's trying to frame me. Janice didn't flinch. Frame you? Mr. Coleman, the evidence speaks for itself. But if you'd like to deny it further, I have something else that might jog your memory. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out a small USB drive and held it up for the room to see. This contains backups of your emails, transaction records, and even memos you thought were deleted. The same files you left sitting unsecured on your desk. The silence in the room was deafening. Coleman's confidence visibly crumbled, his hands trembling as he clenched the arms of his chair. Margaret leaned forward, her tone sharp. You mean to tell me you had sensitive files sitting unsecured in your office? Files that could compromise this company? Janice nodded. He didn't just leave them there once, it was a habit. Carelessness on top of corruption. The board members exchanged looks, their expressions ranging from shock to outright disgust. For years, they had turned a blind eye to Coleman's behavior, dismissing whispers of impropriety as petty office gossip. Now, they were faced with irrefutable proof. The meeting turned into a grilling session. Margaret and Thomas Carter led the charge, presenting the documents while Coleman scrambled to defend himself. Every excuse he offered fell flat under the weight of the evidence Janice had provided. As the hours passed, the atmosphere grew heavier. Coleman's allies on the board stayed silent, clearly unwilling to stick their necks out for a sinking ship. Finally, Margaret stood and addressed the room. Based on the evidence presented here today, I am recommending that Richard Coleman be immediately removed as CEO and that the audit committee proceed with a formal investigation into his actions. The room erupted into murmurs. Coleman shot out of his chair, his voice rising in desperation. You can't do this. I built this company. You'll ruin everything. You ruined it. Margaret cut him off coldly. This isn't about the company anymore. It's about accountability. Coleman's eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but found none. Even his most loyal supporters avoided his gaze. Janice watched silently as security was called to escort Coleman out of the building. He resisted at first, yelling threats and insults, but his bravado had crumbled. By the time the guards reached him, he looked more like a defeated man than the untouchable CEO he had once been. When the boardroom finally emptied, Janice stayed behind, tidying up the space. Margaret lingered, watching her. "You did something incredible today," Margaret said finally. "You stood up for what was right, even when no one else would." Janice smiled softly. "I just did what needed to be done. Someone had to." Margaret tilted her head, studying her. "You're sharp, Janice. Sharper than most people in this building. Have you ever considered working in a different capacity?" Janice blinked, surprised by the question. "You mean, not cleaning?" Margaret nodded. "You clearly have a mind for strategy. If you're interested, I'd like to talk to you about a more permanent role, something that suits your talents." For the first time in a long while, Janice felt truly seen. "I'd like that," she said quietly. Later that evening, as Janice walked out of the building, the weight she had carried for years felt lighter. She had fought for the people who worked here, for the ones who had been ignored just like her. And in doing so, she had proven that even the most invisible among us have the power to make a difference. If you were in Janice's position, would you have taken the same risks? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more inspiring stories just like this one. Your support helps us share incredible tales of resilience and courage with the world. The next day, the office was buzzing with the aftermath of the boardroom shakeup. Everyone had heard about Richard Coleman's dramatic removal, and speculation ran wild about what would happen next. Some were relieved, others were nervous, but one thing was certain: the company had entered a new chapter. Janice arrived for her morning shift as usual, but this time, the atmosphere felt different. People who had barely noticed her before now paused to greet her with warm smiles or appreciative nods. A few whispered their thanks as she passed by. "Hey, Janice," Jason called out from his desk, waving her over. "You're a legend, you know that?" She chuckled, shaking her head. "Just doing what anyone would have done." "No," Emily chimed in, leaning against Jason's desk. "Not anyone would have had the guts to take down someone like Coleman. You didn't just stand up for yourself, you stood up for all of us." Janice felt a swell of pride but quickly waved it off. "It wasn't just me. You two played a big role, too. It took all of us to make it happen." Upstairs, the board was already in damage control mode. Margaret Lewis had stepped in as interim CEO, and her first priority was stabilizing the company. Meetings were scheduled back-to-back, and new policies were being drafted to ensure nothing like Coleman's mismanagement could ever happen again. Margaret hadn't forgotten her conversation with Janice, though. That afternoon, she called her into the executive suite for a private meeting. For the first time, Janice entered the office as more than just a cleaner. "Thank you for coming," Margaret said, gesturing for her to take a seat. The room, usually intimidating with its sleek furniture and expansive views of the city, felt oddly welcoming with Margaret at the helm. "I wanted to personally thank you again for what you did," Margaret continued. "It took courage and intelligence, and frankly, it's the kind of leadership we need more of in this company." Janice raised an eyebrow. "Leadership? I'm just a custodian." Margaret smiled. "Not anymore. I meant what I said yesterday. I see real potential in you. If you're interested, I'd like to offer you a role in compliance and ethics. With your eye for detail and your moral compass, you'd be a tremendous asset." Janice stared at her, stunned. "You want me to work in an office?" "Not just any office," Margaret said with a grin. "My office. You'd report directly to me." The offer was life-changing, but it wasn't an easy decision. That evening, Janice sat at her dining table, staring at the contract Margaret had given her. The terms were generous, more money than she had ever imagined earning, along with benefits and a chance to grow within the company. But part of her hesitated. She had spent years as a cleaner, taking pride in her work despite the way others treated her. Stepping into an office job felt like stepping into a world that had ignored her for so long. Her mind drifted to her late husband, David. She could almost hear his voice. "You could run a company yourself." He had always believed in her, even when she doubted herself. With a deep breath, Janice made her decision. She signed the contract. On her first day in her new role, Janice walked into the office wearing a tailored blazer Margaret had gifted her. Heads turned as she made her way to the executive floor, But this time, the looks weren't dismissive or mocking. They were filled with admiration. Margaret greeted her with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard, Janice." "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "I'm ready to get to work." Janice quickly proved herself in her new position. Her years of observing the company from the ground up gave her a unique perspective that no one else had. She implemented policies to protect employees from exploitation, revamped the whistleblower program, and ensured transparency in all financial dealings. Word of her efforts spread quickly, earning her the respect of employees at every level. She became a symbol of integrity and perseverance, a reminder that anyone, no matter where they start, can make a difference. But not everyone was happy about the changes. Coleman's former allies, still bitter about his downfall, began to plot behind the scenes. They saw Janice as a threat to their power and influence, and they weren't about to let her succeed without a fight. One evening, Janice received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "Be careful who you trust." Attached was a spreadsheet showing discrepancies in a recent budget proposal, discrepancies that implicated one of the executives who had been loyal to Coleman. Janice's heart sank. The corruption wasn't gone, it had just shifted. She brought the email to Margaret the next morning. "It looks like we're not out of the woods yet," she said, placing the printout on Margaret's desk. Margaret frowned as she scanned the document. "This isn't just a mistake. Someone's trying to undermine us." Janice nodded. "And we need to figure out who." Margaret leaned back in her chair, her expression resolute. "Then let's find them. Together." Janice smiled. She wasn't just cleaning up after others anymore. She was cleaning house. Janice and Margaret launched a quiet but thorough investigation into the latest signs of corruption. Unlike before, when Janice had to act alone and in the shadows, she now had resources, authority, and a trusted ally by her side. The stakes were still high, but this time, she wasn't fighting the battle alone. It began with the anonymous email. Janice and Margaret pored over the attached spreadsheet, identifying irregularities in a budget allocation for a recent project. The numbers didn't add up, and Janice's trained eye quickly noticed a pattern. Money was being funneled into a shell account, much like the schemes Richard Coleman had orchestrated. "This isn't sloppy bookkeeping," Janice said, pointing to the data. "This is intentional." Margaret nodded. "Agreed. But the question is, who's behind it? And how deep does this go?" They started by reviewing key personnel involved in the project. Janice, who had spent years observing office dynamics from the periphery, had a hunch about where to look first. One name stood out, James Riker, a senior executive who had been one of Coleman's staunchest allies before his downfall. "Riker's always been good at keeping his hands clean," Janice explained. "He lets others take the fall while he pulls the strings from behind the scenes." Margaret frowned. "Then we'll have to catch him in the act. Let's audit everything he's touched in the last 6 months." As the investigation progressed, Janice and Margaret uncovered more troubling signs. Riker had indeed been siphoning funds, but he wasn't working alone. Emails and transaction logs revealed a small network of executives who were quietly trying to rebuild the power structure Coleman had left behind. They were careful, but not careful enough to escape Janice's meticulous attention to detail. One night, as Janice reviewed yet another batch of documents, she stumbled upon a startling revelation. Among the fraudulent transactions was a direct link to the company's HR department. Someone in HR was helping cover up the embezzlement by falsifying payroll records and deleting whistleblower complaints before they reached Margaret's desk. Janice's heart sank. "It's bigger than I thought," she murmured. The next morning, she presented her findings to Margaret, who immediately called an emergency meeting with the internal audit team. Together, they devised a plan to expose the network without tipping them off. It involved planting fake data in the company's systems, numbers that appeared genuine but would trigger an alert if tampered with. If they try to manipulate these files, Janice explained to the team, we'll know exactly who's involved and how they're doing it. Margaret nodded. "It's risky, but it's our best shot at catching them red-handed." The trap was set, and all they could do was wait. Days passed without incident, and Janice began to worry that their plan had been discovered. But then, late one night, the alert came. Janice's phone buzzed with a notification from the audit system. Someone was accessing the fake data. She called Margaret immediately. "It's happening. They're making their move." Margaret and Janice rushed to the office, where the IT team was already tracking the activity in real time. The digital trail led directly to James Riker's office, where he was logged into the system under the guise of reviewing budget adjustments. The team watched as he manipulated the numbers, clearly unaware that he was walking straight into their trap. Within minutes, the IT team locked him out of the system and flagged his actions as a security breach. Riker, realizing too late what had happened, tried to cover his tracks, but it was no use. Janice and Margaret arrived at his office just as he was packing up his belongings in a panicked rush. "Going somewhere, James?" Margaret asked, her voice cold and authoritative. Riker froze, his face pale. I don't know what you're talking about." Janice stepped forward, holding up a tablet displaying the incriminating data. "Then maybe you can explain this." Security escorted Riker out of the building as Margaret addressed the remaining members of the board. She presented the findings from their investigation, detailing how Riker and his network had attempted to rebuild the corruption Coleman had left behind. "This stops now," Margaret declared. "From this day forward, this company will operate with transparency, accountability, and integrity. Thanks to Janice, we've not only uncovered this plot but also set a precedent for how we handle misconduct." The board voted unanimously to terminate the implicated executives and implement Janice's new compliance protocols. It was a sweeping victory, but Janice knew there was still work to be done. That evening, as Janice walked through the office one last time before heading home, she felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The people who had once dismissed her were now stopping her in the halls, thanking her for what she had done. But Janice wasn't in it for the recognition. She was in it for the people, the ones who deserved a workplace free from corruption and greed. As she stepped into the elevator, her phone buzzed with a message from Margaret. "Great work today. Let's talk tomorrow about the next steps." Janice smiled. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt truly empowered to make a difference. The company transformed in the months following the downfall of Richard Coleman and James Riker's network. Margaret Lewis officially became the CEO, bringing a refreshing culture of integrity and accountability to the organization. Under her leadership, employees felt empowered to speak up, and the business began thriving in ways it hadn't in years. But at the heart of this transformation was Janice Owens, the woman who had once been invisible but had become the face of change. Janice's role in compliance and ethics grew beyond anyone's expectations. She spearheaded initiatives to create transparency, including an anonymous whistleblower platform, regular audits, and workshops to educate employees about their rights. She also introduced policies that ensured janitorial and maintenance staff, like she had once been, received fair treatment and opportunities for advancement. Her humble beginnings and unwavering moral compass earned her the respect of everyone in the company, from entry-level employees to senior executives. Janice became a mentor to many, sharing her story and reminding them that no matter where they started, they could make a difference. One day, Margaret invited Janice to lunch. As they sat in a cozy corner booth at a nearby cafe, Margaret raised her glass. "To you, Janice. You've proven that leadership doesn't come from titles, it comes from action." Janice smiled, raising her glass in return. "And to you, for believing in me when no one else did." Margaret's expression turned thoughtful. "You know, there's one thing I've been meaning to ask you. All those years you worked here as a custodian, what kept you going?" Janice paused, considering the question. "I guess I've always believed that no matter how small your role seems, it matters. Even when people didn't see me, I saw them. I knew the work I did made their days better, even if they didn't realize it. And I held on to that." Margaret nodded. "Well, you're not invisible anymore. You've built something incredible here, Janice. The company owes you more than words can say." Months later, Janice was honored at a company-wide event. Margaret took the stage to announce the creation of a new annual award, the Janice Owens Integrity Award, given to employees who embodied honesty, courage, and dedication. The room erupted into applause as Janice was called to the stage to accept the inaugural honor. As she stood at the podium, looking out at the faces of her colleagues, she felt a wave of emotion. "I never set out to be a hero," she said, her voice steady. "I just wanted to do what was right. And I'm standing here today because of all of you, because you believed in change. Together, we've proven that no matter who you are or where you come from, you can make a difference." "Thank you." The applause was deafening, but what stayed with Janice the most were the tears in the eyes of her co-workers, the ones who had laughed at her, dismissed her, or simply never noticed her. They weren't tears of pity or shame. They were tears of gratitude, of admiration, of respect. As Janice walked through the building one evening, reflecting on her journey, she stopped by the janitor's closet. She opened the door and ran her hand over the familiar mop and bucket. They were symbols of a life she hadn't left behind but had carried forward with pride. She smiled, closed the door, and walked away, her footsteps steady and sure. She wasn't just a custodian anymore. She was a leader, a trailblazer, and proof that no act of courage is ever too small. Janice Owens had rewritten her story, and in doing so, she had rewritten the future for everyone around her. What inspired you most about Janice's journey? Have you ever seen someone use courage and integrity to change their world? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with your friends. Together, we can spread the message that doing the right thing always matters. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.